Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual AJ100 Club breakfast event. I'm Will Hurst, Managing Editor at the Architects Journal, and once again would like to apologise for the lack of any actual breakfast. However, I can offer you a superb guest this morning, the renowned property developer and design expert Simon Silver of Derwent London. Now, before I introduce Simon, I'd just like to thank our AJ100 sponsors whose support makes these events possible. Many thanks to our headline partners, Rocker, and thank you also to our programme sponsors, Schluter Systems and Siemens Home Appliances. I'd also like to mention something else that the AJ is up to, which I hope will be of interest. You may know that we've relaunched our celebrated 40 Under 40 programme in association with Vitra, which highlights and celebrates the most exciting emerging design in the profession, or design talent in the profession, I should say. The programme was launched in 1985 and last run by the AJ in 2005, when winners included David Adjaye, Amin Taha, AOC, DSDHA, Anna Liu of Tonkin Liu, and the late Gareth Hoskins. We hope the 2020 list will be the most diverse yet and feature architects breaking new ground in what they're designing and the sustainable ways they're practicing, both socially and environmentally. We'll be revealing the lineup in batches of 4 starting today, so please do look out for that. So on to our speaker. We're delighted to be joined this morning by Simon Silver, Executive Director and co-founder, alongside John Burns, of Derwent London. Simon has been a director since 1986, bringing cutting-edge design to office and mixed-use projects for the past 35 years, including the AHMM-designed T building, the Whitechapel building by Fletcher Priest, and the very recent Make-designed 80 Charlotte Street, Derwent's largest scheme to date. An RIBA Fellow, Simon is known for his creativity, brand awareness, and passion for architecture, and recently announced his intention to step down from the Derwent board in February, but to continue supporting the business as a consultant until the end of 2022. So a very warm welcome to Simon. I'll now hand over to him before we take questions from the audience. Any moment now, I'm sure he'll be joining us. And I'm sorry for the slight delay this morning, ladies and gentlemen. We were due to start at 10, but obviously it was a few minutes after that. Simon, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me and see me?
Hi there, yes we can, thank you.
I think actually you muted me originally and I had to unmute myself.
Apologies.
I'm not very technical, and if I didn't have my PA with me, I'd be in all sorts of terrible trouble. But
well, we're in the same club there, Simon, but very glad you're joining us this morning. We can hear you now, so that's great.
Well, thanks, Will, and thank you for that very flattering introduction. And good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to architects thanks to the AJ. I know retrofit is an important campaign being run by the AJ at present, and I'm pleased to tell you that a majority of the Derwent portfolio has been about regeneration of existing buildings, which we have tended to retain as investments for the long term, and where more often than not, we have revisited in order to upgrade those elements of the buildings that have become tired over the years. We do, of course, redevelop certain buildings that come to the end of their life, but when we do construct new buildings, we intend that they conform to the mantra of long life, loose fit, and low energy. Derwent Valley Holdings, as it was originally known, was launched as a new public company on the London Stock Exchange in 1985 with a market capitalisation of just £5 million. My story began a couple of years later in 1987 after the company completed its first major purchase of a company known as Colebrook and Wilmar Estates for £7 million. Included amongst the 200,000 square foot portfolio of buildings was a small group of light industrial buildings in Colebrook Row, Islington. Fortune sometimes favours the brave, and at that time, by an extremely good slice of luck, the use class order of 1987 was reclassified, permitting light industrial spaces of 5,000 square feet and under to be converted to a new classification that they called B1 office, without the need for planning permission. It was about this time that my good friend David Rosen, who ran a commercial agency known as Pilcher Hirschman, introduced me to two young architects who had recently left the employ of Richard Rogers to set up their own practice to be known as Troughton McCaslin. The two partners, Jamie and John, appraised one of our buildings on Colebrook Row, and I can honestly say that what followed was a seminal moment in the history of Derwent. I refer to it as the catalyst for what was to become the company's passion for architecture and design. The building concerned was no more than 5,000 square feet, and one of the first proposals was to cut away about 1/3 of the first floor plate and create a double height space, thereby providing an abundance of volume and light into the building. Losing square feet in such a small building was not particularly well received at first, but when we saw John and Jamie's illustrated visuals of how the space would look, we immediately understood the potential of their proposed transformation to our building. The conversion to offices eventually took place, and the results were quite incredible. Using materials like glass brick to the main facade and entrance, together with timber flooring throughout, was a particularly bold and novel concept at that time in 1987. The building was eventually let for £15 per square foot, which was a top rent in those days and far more than the original passing rent of £2.50 a square foot. We were probably only 10 to 12 people at Derwent at that time, but we were all taken aback by the success of the project, and there was no doubt that the scheme paved the way for our architectural journey ahead. So many good lessons were learned from such a small project. Less was certainly more. The importance of good detailing down to the door handles and shadow gaps, and losing space to make better volume. These strategies definitely became logged and stored in our memory banks for future projects. This image of the interior of the building proves the point that good design can stand the test of time. Although 33 years ago, the building with its contemporary design would still prove popular in today's market. It's actually one of my very favorite images that I've kept in my desk drawer over all those years, and I just find it remarkable because it looks like something that was done yesterday. Our next major project was another light industrial building from the same portfolio. Middlesex House, which was located on Cleveland Street in Fitzrovia, comprised 50,000 square feet. It was multi-let to an assortment of mainly workshop users. However, the building had many attributes, which included a wonderful Art Deco facade to its main elevation and the ever-important factor of volume, which measured around 3 meters floor to soffit. We rewarded Troughton McCaslin with this new project, although due to its size, we settled for what we called in those days a rolling program of refurbishment. Overall, it must have taken us nearly 3 years to work our way through all the floors in the building, which we did as various leases expired. We were again successful with a change of use to B1 offices. It was a comprehensive scheme which included 2 new lifts, renewed M&E throughout, and all the bells and whistles that you would expect today. Middlesex House has proved a great success over the years and still sits proudly in our portfolio, valued at around £90 million, after originally paying a whopping £2 million for its purchase all those years ago. As one Sir Stuart Lipton was reported to say, good architecture pays. The good end to this story is that many years later, the lease to the NCP car park, which was situated on the lower ground floor of the building, finally expired. An area of around 15,000 square feet was converted into a spectacular office, retaining the original ramp that provided vehicular access as the new main entrance and bringing light in from the landscape courtyard above. It was let to none other than Make Architects, and for those of you who may have visited, you will, I'm sure, agree that I'm not exaggerating when I say it's a very special office space. So, now armed with confidence as to our capabilities to tackle larger schemes, we set out looking for bigger industrial buildings for the obvious advantages that they offer in scale, as opposed to the more regular 60s and 70s buildings at that time. We succeeded, and the next purchase was a characterful depository building in Victoria, which was masterfully converted by Michael Squire Architects, who had already refurbished some buildings we owned on Grosvenor Place in 1995. Interestingly, we met Michael, yet another David Rosen introduction, when his practice, numbering 7 people with offices in South Kensington. It seemed that so many of the architects that we met in those early days were just starting out. This included AH100, where Simon Alford pretended to number 8 people in order to impress us, when in fact there were only 4 of them, but that's another story. It wasn't until the end of the 90s that we considered our very first development. We had purchased an old post office building in Broadwick Street, Soho, as part of a large portfolio from the insurance group CIS. It was a rather nasty building, and the only option was to demolish and start again. We decided to be adventurous on this occasion, and the redoubtable Mr. Rosen introduced me to a charming individual called John Young, who was a founding partner at Architects Richard Rogers. We visited some of their schemes, which included the building for Channel 4 in Victoria. It was a fantastic building, both original and exciting. We were happy for John to emulate many of its characteristics within our new building. When he finally came up with his brilliant design, it attracted the Ford Motor Company, who paid us the highest rent achieved in Soho at that time of £50 per square foot. Once again, good architecture paid its way. I personally learnt a lot from John Young, who I realised was particularly responsible for the Rogers concept of contemporary industrial design. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm pleased to say I have stayed in touch with John, even though he is a Southampton fan who lives in New Mexico. After Broadwick Street, anything seemed possible. We sought out talented architects with an amazing array of talent that existed and still does in London. Still in love with industrial buildings, we then purchased a real cracker around 1999. We named it the Tea Building and were happy to discover the charming character of Shoreditch, where it was located. AH100 were appointed. It comprised 2 large intercommunicating buildings totaling around 200,000 feet. This was to be a big challenge. After various studies that involved some ambitious plans, we settled on a more conservative strategy that Simon Alford referred to as the light touch scenario. This involved splitting large warehouse floors into smaller office suites. The creation of a tough new entrance where we retained the original cobblestone was a definite plus. The suites themselves let very well, so we decided to roll them out through the entirety of the buildings, growing more ambitious with the size offering, which increased from small units of 1,500 feet to larger of around 5,000 feet and eventually 10,000 feet. We had great fun in doing so, which is an important ingredient when working with architects up to periods of 3 to 5 years. It has to be fun, as well as the serious side of putting together a great scheme. Whatever space we produce was snapped up quickly. Rents that started at £10 a foot ended up reaching £50 a foot a few years later. It remains one of my favourite projects, and I still retain great pride and joy whenever I visit, which is reasonably often. These are buildings that keep on giving. Even now, we have decided to upgrade our original entrance as we felt it had become tired and needed replanning. The slide on the bottom right shows the latest proposal. Personally, I get just as excited on a small project when we improve an existing building that I love. The message here is, if you own anything valuable in your life, you have to look after it and treasure it. Whilst I love our schemes, I also have a strong sense of commercial value as well. As a public company, Derwent requires to make above average returns. The T building is perhaps one of the most successful buildings within the whole of our portfolio. It was purchased for £20 million in 1999. We have probably spent in the region of 25 to 30 million on the two buildings over the years, and it now stands in our books at circa 220 million and still contains reversionary value with the potential end value of around 260 million. Not bad, considering all the fun and enjoyment we have shared with our professional teams and contractors along the way. You see, good architecture really does pay. I could wax lyrical for another 30 minutes or so, but I have been asked to speak for 12 to 15 minutes. So I will end with one of our most recent successes, namely the White Collar Factory. After all our experience with industrial buildings, Simon Alford conducted what he called a think tank as to the direction we should take with two 1960s buildings that we owned adjacent to Old Street Roundabout as a result of our merger with London Merchant Securities in 2007. At this point, I must thank our former CEO and now chairman, John Burns, together with Robbie Rain, the CEO of what was then known as LMS, for getting together and merging two £1 billion companies. The point being is it gave us a credible portfolio of buildings that became our development pipeline over the last 13 years and still continues to offer us opportunities to the present day. So back to the think tank, AHMN suggested to us that we perhaps create a new progressive office building, but on an industrial scale. Floor to soffit height was proposed to be a whopping 3.5 meters on every floor. Cooling would be cold water pipework embedded in the concrete soffit, which was eventually christened as concrete core cooling. In order to be sure it would work, we built a £1 million working prototype on a vacant part of the site and asked our engineers Arup to test the idea. To cut a long story short, it was tested during a very hot summer and passed with flying colours. Overall, there was just one drawback. The building that was proposed to be 15 stories could easily be increased by yet another 2 stories if we could be convinced to reduce the volume of all the office floors by up to ½ metre. However, to Derwent's credit, we stuck to the original plan. And as it turned out, the office floors proved extremely popular due to their unusual volumes, with tenants paying a premium for the generous cubic capacity that they boasted. This office building is definitely a one-off and contains more floor to soffit volume than any other building in central London. Also, the entrance is 7 meters in height, and the building is overall probably one of the best buildings in our portfolio. Fortune does favour the brave, and good architecture definitely pays. There are too many wonderful projects throughout my incredible journey with Derwent, and I apologise for not mentioning more of them. The Butley building by Matt Yeoman, the Brunel building by Fletcher Priest, and most recently, 80 Charlotte Street by Make Architects are all terrific buildings. I'm so fortunate to have been presiding over the design of all these projects, but there were many, many colleagues who I owe an enormous slice of gratitude. My poor head of development at Derwent, Richard Baldwin, has been driven mad by some of my passionate pleas over many years. But at the end of the day, it's teamwork that counts. And whilst I cannot mention them all individually, there are so many collaborators within all our projects who deserve the utmost praise. Hopefully they all know who they are. My final word is that talented firms of architects and engineers, who to some extent are the unsung heroes of the team, are all absolutely quintessential to a successful scheme. The difference with Derwent is that we drive them very hard despite all the fun, demanding that they deliver excellence, and it's interesting that they all seem to thrive on these ambitions and working with a passionate client. Thank you all very much, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to me.
Thank you, Simon. That was really, really interesting to hear you go through your whole career pretty much, or the highlights. As you say,
I tried to.
It's difficult to squeeze it all in.
Yeah.
We've got some questions coming in, so I'll move to those in a second. And if you're sending in questions, do keep them short, please. But the first thing I wanted to ask you, Simon, was about the difference really in attitude now towards design and architecture. Looking back to that original scheme at Colebrook Row, do you think there is now a more widespread appreciation of the value of design and architecture that you've just outlined, and specifically the financial value?
Oh, well, 100%. I mean, when we started, it was pretty novel doing the things that we were doing. But I think it was picked up by the office agency profession, you know, from small to big firms throughout central London, that people realized that if you could appoint a decent firm of architects and improve your product to the sort of levels that Derwent were doing, then this was the way ahead. And I think it sounds a little bit immodest of me, but I think in many ways, you know, what Derwent did, we trend-setted from the beginning. And I think it was very much picked up by other property companies, and they realized the value of good architecture.
And as you say, you've been pursuing an approach which is about reusing existing buildings for many, many years. And as you pointed out, that's the subject of our ongoing Retro First campaign, because we now know obviously how important this kind of strategy is for climate reasons, and keeping or trying to reduce the carbon emissions of construction, which are very high. Why did you go down that route in the first place? That, you know, the default seemed to be more about working with existing buildings rather than new builds.
But being very honest with you, Will, we started, as I mentioned when I spoke, as a very small company. You know, we were valued at £5 million. So, you know, we were buying buildings for hundreds of thousands of pounds, not millions.
Sure.
And what we chose to pick were buildings that were neglected, buildings that people had let, you know, become tired. And by appointing architects, we soon learned that we could regenerate these buildings and give them a new lease of life, possibly adding a floor at the top of the building, improving the main entrance, which was obviously, you know, that the impression everybody gets when you walk into a building is the entrance. And it started there really, and regeneration was very much the order of the day for the first few years. And it wasn't until Broadwick Street came along, and when we appointed Richard Rogers, which was very unusual for us because we were working with many smaller firms of architects, and Richard Rogers was rather grandiose for us to go to. But it was a very, very pleasurable experience. As I said, John Young was an absolutely amazing man, and we all learned so much from him, as we did most of the architects we worked with. I mean, I'm personally particularly very lucky that when I think of all the firms I've worked with over all the years, how much they've actually taught me along the road, and how much of the value has gone back into the Derwent buildings.
And are you still going to be involved in that direct appointment of architects, Simon, when you're a consultant, or will you be handing over the reins?
I'm pleased to say that I will be. The agreement that I've reached, I stand down at the end of February, but I'm going to be a consultant for at least 2 years and maybe 3 on all our projects. And we have quite a long and deep pipeline at Derwent. As I speak at the moment, we're doing a fantastic scheme with AHMM opposite Centrepoint. known as Soho Place, where we're building not only a shop and office building, but one of London's first new build theatres for many, many years. And that's a very exciting project. We're also back at Old Street Roundabout with Joe Morris. And Joe Morris used to work with Simon Alford, and of course now runs Morris and Company. And he's building us a brand new building called the Featherstone on Featherstone Street. Next year, we hope to be starting a Big Island site, which we're doing on Baker Street. It's a project with the Portman Estate, and we're doing that with Hopkins, and the list goes on. I mean, our love of working with good Central London architects is boundless.
Yeah, I'm sure people remember it was the Astoria, wasn't it, that was on that site?
Yeah, that's right. That very quickly, without going on too long, I mean, the Astoria, it was a real one-off. We bought the main building on Charing Cross Road, which we converted with Troughton McCaslin in the very early days, and the Astoria was obviously listed, and we couldn't touch it. But along came Crossrail, and Crossrail decided to compulsory purchase the Astoria, and they demolished it. So as a property company, we had to be extremely careful. I don't think we'd have been very popular if we'd have been sort of the company that demolished the Astoria. So they paved the way, and after demolition, it gave us the opportunity to build a much larger building and a new building, which is obviously what we then continued to do.
Yeah. So I'm going to now turn to some questions from the audience. John Walker asks, Simon, what is more important, the architect or the brief you give an architect?
The architect. The architect comes first, without doubt. I think I used the word quintessential when I was speaking, and I think Derwent's delight in finding architects, you know, we obviously have fantastic relationships with some of the firms that I mentioned, but we still look for new talent, and that new talent comes in the form of small firms of architects that will undoubtedly grow as they become more successful. So I think the choice of architect comes first, and then the brief obviously comes second, you know, depending on the project.
So another question here from Rupesh Hatkar. Hi Simon, what are the important factors which are considered in the design of, well, I'm not sure you've been that involved in this. He's asking about residential apartments. Did Derwent do resi?
We've done 2 or 3 over the years,
yeah,
where I think due mainly to planning, where, you know, we're looking to build like for example, Make at 80 Charlotte Street. We owned a Big Island site, and we were demolishing 60s buildings, and the planners wanted us to have a certain you know, amount of residential within our offering, and we were happy to do it. And many years ago, we actually converted some buildings into residential. But no, as a rule, it's not really what we concentrate on. It's all about Central London offices.
Yeah, but I guess a lot of the principles are exactly the same in terms of volume and natural light and so on.
Well, actually, it's interesting. I mean, the one residential project that I really enjoyed was with Mike Stiff of Stiff and Trevelyan. There was an Art Deco building down in Bayswater. I think it was once upon a time it started life as a cinema, and it came back to us vacant, and we kept the facade. We retained the Art Deco facade, and we demolished behind it, and we built an apartment block of about, I think it was about 22 flats. And I must admit, I thoroughly enjoyed the whole process. And I think the flats were very successful, and we stuck to our guns, sort of emulating in part what we do with offices. Lovely, beautiful entrance, making sure each flat had its own characteristics. And it went very well. And although it's something we don't major on, when we have to do it, we'll use the same sort of philosophy as we use, I suppose, when considering office buildings.
Yeah, but obviously offices have been at the epicenter of the impact of COVID. So quite a few audience members are asking about that. Martin Brown asks, with talk of more home office working, well, it's more than talk really, isn't it? lot more home office working and less commuting into central London or central offices. How do you see the demand for new office developments, particularly multi-storey offices, over the next 5 to 10 years?
I thought somebody probably would ask that question, but you know, I'm slightly biased. I think in the long term, and I don't know how long term is, that things will revert to near normal, and that includes people occupying office buildings. You know, social interaction is everything. Anybody that's run a small company to a large company knows that you get things done when you all get together and you collaborate, and we can do it over as I'm talking to you now with technology, but it's not the same. You don't get the same buzz and you don't get the same sort of ingredients. So I think at the moment we're going through a very tough time. I mean, a lot of Derwent buildings, the occupation is very low indeed, but there's no doubt that when people are encouraged to return, when we take, you know, all the issues on board that have to be taken in making a building safe, people undoubtedly, the feeling within our portfolio is people want to get back to their buildings. Again, I'm being biased, but you know, some of the buildings that we've got, you know, are the best in class, and people want to get back to them. You know, if you're a tenant at the Brunel building in Paddington, you know, right by the canalway, I mean, it's a fantastic environment, and you'd much prefer to be there than working at home. I mean, I've been working at home like many of us, and yeah, I get by, but I get very bored. And
it's monotonous, isn't it?
I'm even today just coming back into Savile Row, which was a terrific conversion of a building. It was never a very special building, but it was ripped apart by Piercy and Company, and they did a brilliant job. And just being here is a delight. And it, you know, years later, it gives me terrific enthusiasm to go to work. And I'm sure that must be the same with lots of other people.
Sure. So a question from an anonymous attendee. Are there any lessons you've learned when tendering to appoint a firm of architects on how to get the best results from that tender process to appoint the most appropriate firm?
Well, that's another interesting question, because we don't tender architects. We're very definite about who we want to use. And I think what we do is we do a lot of detective work, and we know pretty much who's out there, you know, new firms that are emerging, firms that are obviously out there who've been doing their business for many years. So when we have a project on board, we will actually sit down together at Derwent, you know, 5 or 6 of us, and we will all agree to go to one firm. So we don't tender architects, and maybe that's very different to other property companies, I don't know. But we tend to be definite about who we want to use, and often giving an opportunity to someone we haven't worked with before.
So does that mean that you're typically approaching that firm of architect that you've not worked with before and saying, do you fancy coming and doing something for us? Or can it happen the other way around with ambitious young architects knocking on your door?
No, absolutely. I mean, I can actually mention names. I mean, most recently we bought a building in Brixton, which we're very excited about. It's a 60s building in Brixton called Blue Star House. It's not a very good 60s building. It's got very low floor to ceiling height. So as I said in my presentation, when buildings come to the end of their natural life and you really can't do much with them, you look at development. And there was one firm that had caught our eye recently called Carmody Grawk. And we thought we'd love to meet them. And we got them in, and they did a terrific presentation at our offices in Savile Row, and showed us their portfolio of buildings that they've worked on in recent years. And we were very taken with them. And we have actually appointed them as architects to, you know, approach the local authority in Brixton. Eventually, we will be making a planning application for a new building.
Yeah,
and that's that's often the way we play it.
Yeah, and they'll be known to AJ readers, Carmody Grawk, and it's an interesting building, that one that you just described. It's opposite the Brixton Academy, isn't it?
It's opposite where? Oh,
isn't it opposite the Brixton Academy?
Yeah, it's near the Brixton Academy.
Near the Brixton Academy,
it's very near, you know, David AJ is doing a lot of work in Brixton. And it's a really interesting area. And what some people don't realise when you mention the word Brixton is if I jump on the tube from Oxford Circus, which is literally next door of Savile Row, it takes us about 12 minutes to get to Brixton. Even by car, if we drive there from Savile Row, it takes us between 15 and 20 minutes. So it's a very, very accessible location. It's a particularly interesting area. And a bit like when we first bought the T building in Shoreditch, we're very excited about the prospect that Brixton offers. So watch this space. I think Carmody Group will come up with a great building.
Okay. So we've still got questions coming in.
Yeah.
This is one from Scott Grady. Hi, Simon. What is next for the office market given the last 9 months? Do you think the emphasis on well-being will come to the fore? That's Scott from Haptic Architects.
Yeah, I think obviously people are going to be thinking differently about how they occupy offices and well-being. I think the effect that COVID has had on us with social distancing, I think there is going to be in the short term a very different way of tenants occupying, but I think how tenants occupy is very much going to be up to them individually. The landlord will provide certain facilities, I don't know, within perhaps the reception area where you arrive, whether it's temperature testing and you know, sanitizing and everything else that is happening at the moment. But I think offices, people will think differently. I suppose what will be difficult is you'll be occupying more space with less people, and that could make it more expensive. And in the short term, you could see rents coming down a little bit in central London, you know, just as they've done in other recessions. But I do think London is an amazing place, and whatever we suffer over the next maybe couple of years, it will undoubtedly bounce back. It's a brilliant capital and people love it, love working in it. It's got the museums, it's got culture, it's where everybody wants to be. And I think it will revert to close to norm eventually.
Mm-hmm.
I'm no expert, that's just my take on it.
So now a question about climate. Ram Boydell asks, have you actively pursued embodied carbon or circular economy actions on projects? And where do you see sustainable development going into the market?
Yeah, we actually have a sustainability department at Derwent. Run the head of sustainability is a gentleman called John Davis, who's much more knowledgeable than me, and I should really have him sitting next to me to answer this question properly. But as some of you might have read in the press recently, Derwent came up with a carbon-free program by hopefully 2030. So, you know, we've been working on this now for a couple of years. And obviously, you know, we understand the problem and, you know, the fact that I would imagine, as well as new developments like the one in Brixton, I mean, we're not going to hold back from new development just because of the carbon question when a building has undoubtedly come to the end of its life. But I think we will be looking a lot more at regeneration, at refurbishment, and at embodied carbon, rather than, you know, the big developments that we've been pursuing in recent years. Yeah,
and I guess there's also all these issues about the kind of materials that you use and the natural materials. Quite apart from whether you can reuse a building, it's about using less concrete and less steel.
Yeah, I was about to say the one that worries me is concrete, because we've absolutely loved working with concrete, and it's, you know, a brilliant material. But yeah, the industry has probably got to think again. You know, are we going to be building, you know, buildings made out more out of timber like they have done with residential? I don't know, but we've got a fantastic group of advisors, engineers, architects, and the rest. And I'm sure the professions will come up with the answers over a period of time, but we will all be collaborating very hard to obviously reduce the amount of carbon to as low a number as possible in future years.
And I mean, this is maybe a silly question, which I've just come up with, but given your name, Derwent London, does that mean you do not work outside the M25 at all?
Not a silly question. We are 100% committed to London, and that's why we changed the name. The original name was Derwent Valley Holdings. It hailed from Yorkshire, actually. It was a company we bought for £1 million that was listed on the London Stock Exchange, which is rather a romantic story, actually. But we changed it to Derwent London because obviously that was our focus. But I'll surprise you, we actually own an industrial estate in Scotland.
Wow.
Right? And we do own some property outside of town, which was inherited when we merged with LMS. But as far as acquisition is concerned, we only look in London.
I see.
But London's a very large place.
It is. Yeah, enough to keep you busy.
Lots to look at.
Another question from the audience. Ian Weddell asks, how do you balance long-lasting, timeless design with fashion and trends in interior design?
Yeah, an interesting question. I mean, I think we've stuck to our last when it comes to actual architectural design. You know, we're definitely from that modernist group of less is more, of good materials, but not too many of them. And when it comes to interior design, I think you've got to remember that when we put up a new office building, we don't know who's going to move into it on day one. I mean, a lot of our buildings are multi-tenanted. And so often tenants will move into our floors and they will employ the designer to fit out that floor. And sometimes we get rather worried because we think, oh, we hope they stay true to the architecture of the building. And interestingly, more often than not, fit out, I think, in central London has improved dramatically over the years. We had some ghastly fit outs in our very early years. But if you went to something like the Brunel building, you'd be really taken back by the amazing care and attention that some of the tenants there have taken. I'd like to show anybody around the Brunel to show the level of fit out. It's quite wonderful. And it gives us great feeling of optimism for the future that tenants are prepared to, you know, spend that sort of funding on their office space, because I suppose what they're doing really is advertising their brand. It speaks about them, and that's the great thing about office space in London.
And the one you mentioned, I think it's 19 to 35 Baker Street, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're working on with Hopkins.
Yes.
That looks like a pretty large project, is that right? It's another big one like the Make one that you did
Absolutely.
recently?
It's very much like 80 Charlotte Street. It stretches from Baker Street all the way through to Gloucester Place, where there are buildings that were owned by the company. And the centre of the site, for those that know it, and probably not many people do, it's actually a car park, which is really strange. So we're able to take the opportunity of infilling the whole of that site and starting again. And Hopkins have come up with some terrific ideas, which include having a landscaped thoroughfare that runs through from one entrance on Baker Street all the way through to Gloucester Place. So it becomes a place. It's not just another office building. It becomes a landscape place that people can gladly walk through on their way to work, should they want to cut through it. There'll be retail offerings within it, and it's public realm. It's genuine public realm, and it gives me great pleasure. I mean, we've tried to create public realms, whether it's at the White Collar Factory or other buildings, but to be honest, it's fairly limited when you've got a single office building as to what you can do. When you've got an island site, you've got a lot more ammunition. And I'm very, very excited about the potential of Baker Street. I think it's going to be something very different and new for Derwent, and we look forward to working with Hopkins on that one.
And as we saw from the picture of the White Collar Factory, you've actually got a running track on the roof, haven't you? Which is quite novel.
Yeah, do you know, I always laugh when we talk about it, because I do actually remember the meeting with Simon Alford. We were all sitting together, and he said, oh, you know, we're building this sort of extra height top floor. What about putting a running track on the roof? And we all looked at him and went, that's a pretty cool idea. It would probably be the first running track on a roof that's ever been considered in London, and obviously it was. And we all just went for it, and it was very similar at the Tea Building. I remember them saying, swimming pool on the roof. Actually, that was a tenant of ours, Soho House. They came to see us and they said, we'd like to build a swimming pool on your roof. And we all looked at each other and thought, fair enough, why not? So I think you've got to be open to all these ideas. And it, as I said in one of the paragraphs in my presentation, it's got to be fun. You've got to have fun doing these projects. You've got to let your imagination run a little wild. You know, you might not do everything that architects and people come up with, but things like running tracks, swimming pools, I think are all for the good. And I know the communities in both those buildings really enjoy those amenities.
Okay. Another question on environmental design. Alex Franklin asks, that's a good question actually, because we were on the subject of fit outs. He says, fit outs can be materially hugely wasteful. So in our Cat B work, we try to assess what materials can be upcycled. What role can a landlord play in helping reduce waste and upcycle quality materials?
Well, we've always taken the attitude, as I said earlier, that, you know, the tenants are going to do the major fit out. We've got to provide them with the tools. You know, we're putting in the air conditioning systems. We're putting in the raised floors, the lighting. We're hopefully giving it a degree of decoration that makes it look attractive, so that when prospective tenants come round to view, that they'll think, oh yeah, we'd love this floor, but they're going to do their own thing in it. They're going to create their own brand, and obviously landlords don't interfere with that. So I'm repeating a little bit what I said earlier, but I think it's just giving them the tools and giving them the vision that this could be a terrific floor, and then let them get on with it from, you know, in their phase of works.
Yeah, but I think it's these sort of issues about reuse and recycle and upcycling are becoming more and more important, aren't they? And I guess architects and engineers are starting to think about this a lot, but with fit out, that is a kind of intrinsically quite a wasteful thing, isn't it? If you get new tenants coming in and saying, well, we don't like that, we want to rip it all out. And
yeah, well, in the early days when we came across these 60s and 70s buildings, some of the audience probably won't be old enough to remember, but they were full of these awful lowered ceilings. And the first thing we would do at Derwent is we would delight in going into those buildings and taking out the ceilings and improving the floor to ceiling heights, which were quite restricted. And having done that, I think it sets the pattern for many years ahead. And you know, as to what lighting a tenant might put in and how adaptable it is, you know, things do come to the end of their life and you can't stop people from replacing things. But I think less is definitely more, and minimalism is a good thing in office fit out. I think so Derwent often take it back to its bare bones, put in the essentials, and that makes it very adaptable. I think it's that long life loose fit mantra that I mentioned, yeah. and I think that's really what it's about.
But you must have had times in your career, Simon, where you've done a building that you're very proud of, and then some tenants come in and done something absolutely horrendous that you can barely bear to look at.
I'm smiling because I won't mention any names, but absolutely, and it's still with trepidation. I mean, even today, when we finish a building and the tenant signs the lease, you're praying that they will do a good job, and luckily they in the main they do. Sometimes we actually, what surprises me about that, Will, is why tenants don't often go to the landlord's architect, because if they love the building so much to take space in it, you think, well, let's use the same guys that built it. And it doesn't seem to happen very often. You know, but what's very nice, sometimes some of our architects do get instructed, although we've got Make who are doing 80 Charlotte Street. One of our new tenants, which is on a pre-let, who are taking nearly half the building, have gone to Piercy Connor, to Stuart Pearcey to fit it out. So it gives me terrific confidence to know that they're going to have great offices, and it's someone I know, someone reliable, someone who's got fantastic touch and terrific taste in materials. But yeah, every so often there's a nightmare fit out, and it's unavoidable. We cannot stop people doing what they want to do.
Yeah. I guess you just have to be polite and say,
they're paying you £50 a foot, £60 a foot. It's up to them how they fit their offices out.
Yeah. And Stuart Pearcey is an example of an architect who's been very, I don't know what the word is, but sort of assertive in terms of saying, I've got something to offer. I'm going to go and tell clients all about this, isn't he? I think he's talked about that sort of door knocking mentality, which perhaps not all architects have. Yeah. Do you think that's something that they should all try and develop?
Yeah, I mean, the firms we use, obviously there are differences between them, but we alight upon them, whether it's Carmody Grawk, Stuart Pearcey. There's something about their work that attracts us. And with Stuart, it is a lightness of touch and materiality that they use. I mean, it is, I think, phenomenal. And in fact, we've actually instructed them on one of the buildings that we own in Fitzrovia. It's called the Network Building, and they're going to be looking at that building over the next 2 or 3 years. It's a building that's come to the end of its life, and hopefully Stuart and his team will put up a lovely new building one day. But yeah, everybody's got very different tastes to each other. So,
and different tactics for winning work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we meet architects and we see their portfolios, it's very much, we're often attracted by the same common denominators that a lot of our architects share. Whilst there are subtle differences between them, there's still that no fuss modernism, that we started off with many, many years ago and haven't really given up on. It's just perhaps become a bit more sophisticated.
Yeah. Well, I hope you'll be interested in our 40 under 40 list, which, as I said at the beginning, we're revealing in batches over the next few days.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I mean, we're always, although we're armed with a fantastic array of architects, we're always looking for new talent, and we're always very happy to meet, young guys out there who started small firms. And, often I meet with them at Savile Row. There might not be a job immediately available. In fact, there might never be a job for them, but we're very happy to meet them. And we're very much committed to good architecture and design.
I think we've only got time for one more question. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
But, I hope
so. Another anonymous member of our audience asks, is there a building, it's a good one, is there a building in London that you wish Derwent had built?
Oh, I thought I was going to be asked, actually. I thought I was going to be asked what are my favourite buildings in London. And
well, do tell us. We should have asked that.
Yeah, and it's always very, very difficult. But there are certain structures. I mean, they're not all office buildings. Things that have attracted, me personally. I mean, I'm going back way back, and it's not a building, but I tell you what's an amazing structure, and that's go to Regent's Park Zoo and look at the penguin enclosure. I think it was by Bertold Lubetkin. I think it was.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant building.
Yeah, the penguins don't like it.
I love Lloyd. Talking of big office buildings, I love Lloyd's of London. I think Lloyd's of London was a phenomenal building when it was built, and still is. And it was daring architecture, industrial design, and I love it. Going back many, many years, I love The Economist. I love the public realm that they created around The Economist. I mean, that was daring. It was in the middle of St. James's. You can imagine how conservative planning must have been in those days. And for the Smithsons to have come up with The Economist, I thought was fantastic. So I often will divert wherever I'm going and walk around that complex and cut through it because it's such a fabulous building. You could go on and on. I like the South Bank developments. I like everything that was done at the South Bank, in the early days from the 60s, and all the great architects, Hugh Casson and you know, wonderful, wonderful, you know, 60s architects. I don't know, you could go on and on, whether it's here or abroad. One of the things Derwent has done, which is worth mentioning before I finish, and that is we've done architectural trips abroad to be inspired. And we actually went with Simon Alford to America, and it was there that we saw a lot of Mises' work, and we went to his buildings, and we went to the university campus, where we saw all sorts of different architects had done wonderful buildings. And I think you can be inspired by traveling. Unfortunately, I don't get the time to always do it, but we've done architectural field trips to America. We've been to Holland. Not often. We've probably done it, I don't know, once every 5 years, but it's very inspiring to see architects from the early years, from the past. And often past architects have inspired our future, you know, with some of their vision, you know, and it's been Louis Kahn, you know, is another great architect that we've admired, you know, the one stone and timber and the way he fused the materials. And it's that inspiration that always drives us on, that when we're looking at our buildings, we often use a firm of architects from way back when in order to move forward.
Yeah.
So I'm a very, very lucky individual. You know, I spend most of my working week, you know, I could be looking at a new architecture book or whatever, but I just have thoroughly enjoyed it. And I can't believe that 30 years has gone by so quickly.
Yeah, it's good if it's gone in a flash, in a way.
I haven't gone
means
quite
you've been
yet.
having fun.
As I said, I've still got a couple of years left, so I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, Simon, thank you very much for joining us. As I say, it was a great talk, and lots of questions from the audience, so very engaged. Really, that's concludes our AJ100 Club event for today. So thank you once again to Simon and to everyone joining us this morning.
Well, thanks to you, and thanks very much to the AJ for allowing me to chat away and talk about all my passions.
Pleasure. I'd also like to thank our sponsors once again, headline partner Rocker, and program sponsors Schluter Systems and Siemens Home Appliances. Our next breakfast takes place obviously at the beginning of 2021, and we'll be sending details out for that shortly, so do keep an eye out for that. Thanks again, and goodbye.